Picture this. You're Doug Ford, Premier of Ontario. You've spent years convincing auto manufacturers to invest billions in Canadian plants. You've fought tooth and nail to keep the automotive industry alive in your province. And then you wake up one morning to find out the federal government just struck a deal to let 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles flood into Canada at bargain basement tariff rates. Oh, and what did we get in return? Canola. Again. I swear, if I had a nickel for every time Canadian politicians traded our manufacturing sector for agriculture access, I could probably buy one of those cheap Chinese EVs myself. Welcome back to Canadian Insights, where today Doug Ford is absolutely losing it over what he's calling a lopsided deal that's about to hand China a foothold in our auto market while Canadian workers get left holding the bag. Buckle up, because this trade deal drama is accelerating faster than a Tesla on ludicrous mode, and the collision course between Ottawa and Queen's Park is about to get real messy. So let's break down what actually happened here, because the details matter and they're wild. Prime Minister Mark Carney, in what's being called a major shift in Canada-China relations, reached an agreement with Chinese President Xi Jinping this week. Now, Carney's standing there with what he clearly thinks is a diplomatic win, talking about how this is going to open doors for Canadian exporters and improve our relationship with one of the world's largest economies. And what's the deal? China's going to lower tariffs on Canadian canola to 15% by March. They're also dropping tariffs on canola meal, lobsters, crab, and peas from March until at least the end of 2026. So our farmers and fishers get better market access, which sounds great if you're in agriculture or seafood. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. In exchange for China buying more of our canola and crustaceans, Canada's agreed to let 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into our market every year at a tariff rate of just 6.1%. 6.1%. For context, that's barely more than the GST you pay on your morning coffee. We're talking about vehicles that are manufactured in a country with completely different labor standards, environmental regulations, and cost structures, and we're essentially rolling out the welcome mat and saying, come on in, undercut our domestic manufacturers, no problem. And Doug Ford? Doug Ford is not having it. Not even a little bit. The man issued a statement so fast after this deal was announced that you'd think his office had a draft ready to go the moment they heard the words China and electric vehicles in the same sentence. Ford's calling this exactly what it looks like, a lopsided deal that invites a flood of cheap made-in-China electric vehicles without any real guarantee of equal or immediate investments in Canada's economy, auto sector, or supply chain. Now, before anyone accuses me of just parroting Ford's talking points, let's look at the actual numbers here, because they tell a story. Ontario's auto sector employs over 90,000 workers. That's 90,000 people whose livelihoods depend on the health of the automotive industry. In 2024 alone, over 1.3 million vehicles were built in Ontario. This isn't some niche industry we're talking about. This is a cornerstone of Ontario's economy, a sector that's been there for generations, that supports entire communities, that represents billions in economic activity and tens of thousands of good-paying jobs. And what happens when you allow 49,000 cheap Chinese EVs into the market every year? Well, let's think about it. These aren't going to be luxury vehicles competing with high-end models. These are going to be affordable, probably very affordable, electric vehicles that compete directly with the kinds of cars Canadian manufacturers are trying to sell. Chinese EV manufacturers have figured out how to make electric vehicles for a fraction of what it costs in North America. We're talking vehicles that could retail for $10, $15, maybe $20,000 less than comparable Canadian or American-made models. So you're a Canadian consumer looking to buy an EV. The government's giving you incentives to go electric because climate change and all that. You walk into a dealership and you've got two options, a Canadian-made EV for $4,000 to $5,000, or a Chinese-made EV with similar specs for $30,000. Which one are you buying? Be honest. Most people are going for the cheaper option, especially in an economy where everyone's feeling squeezed by the cost of living. And I don't blame them. But every one of those Chinese EVs that gets sold is a Canadian-made vehicle that doesn't get sold, which means less work for Canadian plants, which means fewer jobs, which means weaker supply chains, which means the whole ecosystem starts to crumble. Ford's not just worried about the direct competition though. He's also sounding the alarm about what this does to Canada's relationship with the United States, which is our largest trading partner and absolutely critical for the auto sector. Here's the thing. The US has been taking a very hard line on Chinese EVs. They've got massive tariffs in place, they're talking about national security concerns, they're basically doing everything they can to keep Chinese vehicles out of the American market. And now Canada's going the opposite direction, opening our market to Chinese EVs at rock-bottom tariff rates. What do you think the American response is going to be? They're going to look at Canada as a potential backdoor for Chinese vehicles into North America. They're going to worry about supply chain integration, about parts crossing the border, about the competitive implications. And their response might very well be to make it harder for Canadian automakers to access the American market. Ford's warning that this lopsided deal risks closing the door on Canadian automakers to the American market, and that's not hyperbole. That's a legitimate risk when you're making trade decisions that put you out of step with your biggest trading partner. Now let's talk about what we got in return, because I want to be fair to both sides here. Agricultural exports to China are genuinely important. Canadian canola farmers have been getting hammered by Chinese tariffs for years. It's been a major irritant in the relationship, and getting those tariffs lowered is a real win for the agriculture sector. Same with seafood exports. Lobster and crab fishers, especially on the East Coast, need market access, and China's a massive potential market. So for those sectors, this deal is actually pretty good news. But here's the question that's driving Ford and a lot of people in Ontario absolutely crazy. Why are we consistently trading our manufacturing sector for agriculture access? This isn't the first time we've had this conversation. It feels like every major trade negotiation Canada enters, we end up sacrificing something in manufacturing or industry to get better access for commodities and agricultural products. And look, I get it, we're a resource-rich country, agriculture is important, but we also have a highly skilled manufacturing workforce and decades of industrial infrastructure that we're just kind of shrugging at and saying, let's trade that for canola access. The political calculation here is pretty transparent too. Carney needs wins. He needs to show that he can manage Canada's relationship with China, which has been absolutely terrible for years. He needs agricultural provinces and sectors to feel like he's fighting for them. He needs to look like a diplomatic heavyweight who can negotiate deals with major world powers. So he goes to China, he comes back with tariff reductions on agriculture and seafood, and he can stand in front of cameras and talk about how he's opened markets for Canadian exporters. But Ontario is Canada's most populous province and a massive part of the electoral map. The auto sector specifically is concentrated in ridings that swing elections. Ford knows this, obviously, it's his province. And he's watching Carney make a deal that threatens one of Ontario's most important economic sectors, and he's thinking, you just handed my political opponents a massive gift, and you're making me look like I can't protect Ontario workers. The politics here are absolutely brutal, and Ford's making sure everyone knows he's on the side of auto workers, not cheap Chinese imports. There's also this broader question about what kind of economy Canada wants to be. Do we want to be a country that makes things, that has advanced manufacturing, that builds complex products like vehicles? Or are we content to be hewers of wood and drawers of water, or in this case, growers of canola and catchers of lobster, while other countries do the value-added manufacturing? Because those are different economic futures with different implications for jobs, skills, innovation, and prosperity. High-tech manufacturing, and modern automotive manufacturing absolutely is high-tech, creates good-paying jobs that support middle-class families. It drives innovation, it builds supply chains, it creates clusters of expertise and capability. Extracting resources and growing crops are important, but they don't have the same multiplier effects, and they are more vulnerable to commodity price swings and weather and other factors outside our control. So when we trade away manufacturing capacity for commodity access, we might be trading long-term economic resilience for short-term gains in specific sectors. And let's address the elephant in the room, which is China itself. Canada's relationship with China has been incredibly fraught. We've had the Huawei situation, the two Michaels, constant tensions over human rights, accusations of interference, the whole 9 yards. And now we're making a deal that gives Chinese manufacturers better access to our market, potentially at the expense of our own workers, while we're still dealing with all these other unresolved issues. It's not like China suddenly became a reliable partner that we can trust to play fair. They're still the same China that's been causing us headaches for years. Chinese EV manufacturers are also heavily subsidized by their government. We're not talking about companies competing on a level playing field. We're talking about companies that have received billions in state support, that benefit from industrial policies designed to dominate global markets, that operate under a completely different system than Canadian manufacturers. And we're going to let them compete in our market at a 6.1% tariff? That's not free trade, that's us voluntarily putting our own players at a disadvantage. Ford's also pointing out that there's no guarantee of equal or immediate investments in Canada as part of this deal. It's not like China's committing to build EV factories in Canada, or to invest in our supply chains, or to create jobs here. They're just getting market access. We're handing them customers, and what are they giving us beyond buying some canola? From Ontario's perspective, this looks like a raw deal where we give up current jobs and economic activity for the possibility that farmers and fishers might sell more product, and even that's not guaranteed because it depends on China following through on its tariff reductions. The timing is also suspect. Why now? Why this deal? Is this genuinely the best deal Canada could get, or is this a political decision driven by other considerations? Is Carney trying to reset the relationship with China for diplomatic reasons and willing to sacrifice auto sector interests to do it? Is he trying to shore up support in agricultural provinces at the expense of Ontario? These are legitimate questions that deserve answers, and Ford's making sure they get asked loudly and publicly. So where does this leave us? We've got a deal that's done, a premier who's furious, an auto sector that's nervous, agricultural sectors that are happy, and a whole lot of uncertainty about what comes next. Those 4 to 9,000 Chinese EVs are going to start showing up in Canadian dealerships, and we're going to find out pretty quickly whether Ford's concerns were justified. If they start eating into sales of Canadian-made vehicles, if plants start scaling back production, if jobs start disappearing, Ford's going to be proven right and Carney's going to have a massive political problem, especially in Ontario. But if the impact is minimal, if Canadian manufacturers adapt and compete, if consumers still prefer domestic or American-made vehicles for quality or reliability reasons, then maybe this works out okay. Maybe Ford's overreacting, maybe the sky isn't falling, maybe this is just political theatre from a premier who loves a good fight with Ottawa. Time will tell, but I'll tell you what, if I'm a worker in an Ontario auto plant right now, I'm not feeling super confident about my job security, and I'm probably pretty pissed at the federal government. What's your take on this? Is Ford right to be sounding the alarm, or is this deal better than it looks? Should we be protecting our auto sector more aggressively, or is cheaper access to EVs worth the trade-offs? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is one of those issues where people's opinions are going to vary wildly depending on where they live and what sector they work in. And hey, if you're still watching, you clearly can't get enough of Canadian political drama, so smash that subscribe button for Canadian insights. We're dropping videos all day, every day, covering every deal, every fight, every controversy in Canadian politics. Hit the bell so you never miss an episode of What Are Canadian Politicians Fighting About Now? Until next time, stay informed, stay skeptical, and maybe don't count on that affordable Chinese EV being worth the price we paid for it.